The title of this video is probably going to be something 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 Lumix S1R2. I wanted to actually just use the camera. No crazy vitriolic responses, no crazy looking at the rolling shutter, dynamic range, minutia. Just taking the camera, going outside to one of the most beautiful places in the world and shooting with it. This is going to be a little bit of a different type of video because this is kind of just a photo and video dump while I answer a couple of questions that were on my mind about the camera. And also this video sponsor is going to be our list. We'll get there. So fun fact about the S1R2 is that this camera is actually meant to shoot more photography, but Lumix has a very strong identity in the video market. Now, you might have not seen a lot of photography information about this camera, and the reason for that might actually be a little bit simpler than you think. Some people, when they got this camera, actually got a code to Capture One in order to actually process the RAW files, and that way they could edit things and put their own style on their own photos. Now, if you're someone who doesn't use Capture One, or you lose your Capture One codes like me because I'm not the smartest person in the world, well then you're only working with the JPEGs, and it's not necessarily enough to go through an entire video talking about the photography features when you're only playing with half a deck. Now, excuses aside, this camera is no slouch in the photography department. It's not the fastest in the world, but while I'm traveling this island of Maui, I've been able to get some stunning photography. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to bring my Fuji GFX 50R because I just keep that thing on me, but one thing that I will say is that if you're looking for a camera to get a lot of high resolution photo, maybe not a super high action sports camera, I think this camera is going to do a fine job. So this camera has the ability to shoot in 8.1K. It also has other modes as well, but it still begs the question, do we need any of these shooting modes? Do we need to shoot in 8.1K or 5.9 or even 4K for that matter? And my answer is going to be not necessarily, but I do like having the choice. Now, some of these clips are going to be in 8.1, some of these are 5.9, some of these are actually in 4K. And one thing that I might challenge you guys with is trying to tell the difference between any of them. Now, if you do need to do things like crop in or reframe your image, 8K makes a lot of sense, 6K makes a ton of sense, even 4K depending on what it is. However, that also comes with a couple of responsibilities. I'm hoping you guys have larger cards, I hope you guys have bigger hard drives, and as well as computers that can actually run 8K and play that back. You don't necessarily need to have the shooting type, it's a lot of resolution for a mirrorless camera and also could have some overheating issues down the line, but at the same time, I do love the freedom of choice. Nowadays with modern cameras, I think one of the cool things is that you can kind of choose your own adventure. There's not a lot of limits to a lot of cameras nowadays. Now, there is going to be a little bit of talk of rolling shutter, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but even that has context to if you don't want to use that mode or you want to avoid having rolling shutter artifacts, you absolutely can. But in terms of the high resolution on the S1R2, do you need 8K? Probably not. Is it nice to have the choice for anything that you needed to? Absolutely. But one thing I would say is just make sure you're prepared to have a larger, higher resolution file. The S1R2's claim to fame, along with other Lumix cameras, is going to be the ability to shoot in open gate, mostly for anamorphic support and anamorphic shooting. Not only can you de-squeeze things in camera, you also have a stabilization mode specifically made for anamorphic footage, but one thing that I find very handy is the fact that you get that in a smaller and relatively cheaper package. Other cameras back in the day have anamorphic support would cost way more than the $3,300 price tag on this guy, and the ability to even have in-body stabilization at the same time was a little bit unheard of, where the S1R2 can do both of them. Now, in conjunction with the stabilization that you get out of here, this makes it a lot easier for me to stick the car out of the back of a trunk with a gimbal and record shooting a motorcycle off of the mountains in Maui. The combination of these things, the anamorphic support, getting the stabilization, makes things a lot easier, especially to keep a smaller camera package. We've been spending the last couple of days in Maui just shooting anything under the sun, literally, and the ability to get footage that looks this good and things that are going to support the now new affordable anamorphic lenses available is something that I can enjoy, because in a smaller camera package, maybe you don't want to bring your full cinema kit out, you're still able to get a lot of that functionality out of something a lot smaller. Now, again, just like having the higher resolution and other things with this camera, you have to be ready for a couple things. For one, you might want to have an anamorphic lens if you're going to use any of these modes. That's nor here nor there. But another thing you want to keep in mind is that when reading in an open gate sensor, the readout's going to be a little bit slower. Now, with anamorphic footage, you might stretch and pronounce that a little bit more. However, in the same time, in a lot of different environments, this is going to be more than reasonable and usable. Artlist has added new features into their website in order to make your editing workflow a lot easier. It's become so much more than just a music licensing website. Now you could drag and drop your different assets into your artboards in order for you to curate the soundtrack for your next project. trying to find the right stock clips could always be a little bit difficult, but now you have different parameters and different filters that you can use to really pinpoint the clips that you need in order to tie your story together. On top of that, a new feature that was added to Artlist was AI voiceover, which comes in handy especially when you need a baseline or you just need that voiceover that you need on a quick turnaround. But on top of that, you also have related assets to the voiceovers that you're going to pick. Now you could pick different stock footage and you could pick different sound effects in order to really tie in together all the assets that you need that match the voiceover. You can try Artlist today by clicking the link in the description down below, but special shout out to Artlist for not only adding these tools to make it easier for creators to do their job, but also making sure that it's in one centralized place. High resolution sensors, rolling shutter is just kind of a fact of life, but I think one of the important pieces of context is to know when is it too much, when is it bearable, and when are the numbers actually going to apply to our own life and our own shooting style. Now, what I will say is depending on your shooting mode, it's going to change drastically. For example, if you're shooting anamorphic footage, you might have more of a risk of having some rolling shutter. Now, one thing I will say is when you're shooting anamorphic, especially in open gate, the sensor has more things it has to read out, which means it's going to be a little bit slower versus not reading those things out at all. And when working with anamorphic footage as well, you're going to run into a little bit of rolling shutter, especially if you don't have something that's faster. That to be said, depending on what you're shooting, sometimes it's not going to bug you and sometimes it might not even matter. Now, I decided to shoot fitness twice and give you a little bit of context in terms of what I mean. In one, when you have controlled movements, you're not swinging the camera around like a crazy person, it's very hard to see some of those rolling shutter artifacts. If you're more controlled with your motion, you plan things out. This is somewhere where maybe you can shoot an open gate anamorphic and not have too much of that jello effect. Now, on the flip side, in conjunction with using anamorphic and also using that high dynamic range mode, you're going to notice a lot of rolling shutter, and sometimes it's way more pronounced than others. When things are locked off where there's minimal handheld movements where I'm not swinging around like a crazy person, it's kind of hard to notice. But then when I decide that I want to put on the boost mode and throw all of the things I want at it, you're going to notice a little bit of uneasiness. Now, this is something that you have to keep in mind. It depends on your shooting style whether or not this is going to work. And I think instead of fighting online about whether or not the rolling shutter is good or bad, it's definitely not fast, but at the same time, the speed by which that you need it might not actually affect you at all. And in some cases, it might. But the easiest way to figure that out is by asking questions, asking for context, and also putting up against things that you already have. The rolling shutter is not entirely fast on the S1R2, but at the same time, it's not the slowest it's ever come out, and we've been fine with other cameras that came out before that actually kind of perform worse. So at the end of the day, it's all up to you and what you actually need to shoot. Now, the S1R2 did add that one feature, dynamic range expansion, and it's not only a very useful feature when used in the right place, but also a source of a lot of contention and a little bit of vitriol for this camera. One of the side effects of expanding your dynamic range, getting that extra stop in your highlights, is going to be a slower readout. There's just more work for the camera to do. And with that came a lot of contention for a lot of people that might have deemed this camera to be unusable. But one thing that I want to address, well, two things I want to address, is one, you could always just turn it off. Which begs the question of why even use it in the first place? Why would this camera even have it? And I think one of the contexts for this camera feature is the fact that I don't think it was made for moving subjects. I don't think it was made for handheld in the first place. Now, as I'm exploring MAUI, even as I explore my own city, one of the things I like doing is getting a nice locked off shot, getting the entire landscape, and really capturing things and letting the scene kind of unfold while things are locked off on sticks. Now, from what I understand from other cameras that have used features that are similar to this is a great way to get that extra dynamic range out of the skies and the highlights and things that would typically be blown out on other cameras while the scene is unfolding and going on. It seems like Lumix just ported that from a photography feature and made it more oriented for video instead, at the cost of the fact that maybe the shutter readout isn't going to be as high as it needs to be. Now, that to be said, if you do need that extra readout, maybe you're shooting in handheld, maybe you're doing a lot of things where you do need to move the camera a bit, well, you can always just turn this feature off. I don't necessarily think the S1R2 is meant to be the be-all and end-all camera for both things in terms of video or photography, but I think it's meant to be a pretty good happy medium between them both. That might come with a couple of caveats like things like rolling shutter and not having ARRI level dynamic range, but I'll also probably say that I've never walked into a room and known exactly how much dynamic range I need in the first place. And for the most part, you adjust the scenes the way that you need to, and unless you're shooting outside with a dark-skinned person with bright sunlight and you need to expose for the sun and the person in front of you, chances are you don't necessarily need that much more dynamic range. But then again, this is just my opinion on this feature. I think it's nice to have. I don't think it actually hurts the camera by having it, but at the same time, I think understanding what some of these features are for are far more valuable than figuring out what this camera can't do and actually doubling down on things that it can.
And so you thought you can escape Uncle Kofi's. Now he's going to wrap this one up, but today's Ghanaian language of the day is how we say a good thing, which is going to be adepa, adepa. and it's a good thing you've made it to the end of this video. At the end of the day, my nephew just wanted to put some talkings over the footage of the Lumix S1Rii. He wants to make sure you have a good day. He wants also to make sure you do adepa and you go and you click the subscribe button. Maybe like the video, leave a comment. But Uncle Kofi and my nephew will see you in the next video. Echina.